Hello, and welcome to All Our Little Messes, a podcast focused on healing through intentional conversations about parenting, relationships, religion, and more. I am your host, Veronica Winrod, and I'm so happy to have you here, listening in on my thoughts today. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, and welcome back to All Our Little Messes. This is episode 10. And I can't believe we made it into the double digits. Like, this is crazy. It happened so fast. I kind of wondered if I'd make it this far, to be perfectly honest. But here we are. And I am so grateful for all of your guys' support. It really means a lot that I've actually been able to make it this far. And it's because of you guys, for sure. I'd also like to give a shout out to the patrons on my Patreon who have also lent their financial support. I really appreciate you guys, and it means a lot that you're there. So today we're going to be talking about how purity culture has twisted the image of what a good or a perfect woman is in Christian and Catholic society. And I have actually had personal experience with this kind of mentality, just through, little things that people would say about the women around them. And of course, there's also the culture that I was brought up in, and like how they treated women and how they talked about women and things like that. And one of the biggest things that was really harped on when it came to what a good woman was the fact that you have to present yourself a certain way. So you have to be sexy, but you cannot be sexual. So meaning like you have to be sexually attractive to the men around you, but you couldn't be so sexually attractive as to tempt them. So you always had to dress in a way that made a man wonder if there was something more to discover about you and your body, essentially. So you had to hide it, hide your body, hide the fact that you're female, but you can't hide it too much. Because then, of course, then you fall into the realm of, we're shabby, or I'm not, what was one that, there was this term that I was always told whenever I would, pick out an outfit or something like that, elegantly dressed. And I actually remember a girls' camp that I went on when I was 9 years old. And they had this little skit that they put on towards the end of the girls' camp. It was 2 weeks long. It was insanely long, and there was like this huge number of girls there. There probably must have been like 50 to 60 of us at least. It was absolutely enormous. And I remember the skit that they put on, and they were basically like trying to teach us girls what we should or should not wear. And so they had like the camp counselors dress up as certain types of women. We had like a hippie woman. We had a woman who just kind of put whatever on. We had one woman who didn't know how to dress for her body type. We had one woman who was immodestly dressed. And then we had like the perfect woman. And she came out wearing a shirt that was like baggy, but not too baggy. And, the sleeves were to her elbows. Her skirt, sat at her hips just right, where you could tell she had hips, but it didn't hug her hips so that you didn't stare at them. And it was, the appropriate length of 8 inches below your knees. Like, it was definitely pushed that we were supposed to dress this way. And if we dressed this way, then we were, elegant. The character was actually called Miss Elegance. And like that is always stuck in my mind for whatever reason. Like I have very few memories of my childhood when I actually stop and think about it, but for whatever reason, that's just like one of those memories that has really stuck out to me was Miss Elegance. So yeah, there was always like this stereotype of a woman and how she must be dressed. There was also a book called Dressing with Dignity that was always pushed. It was written by a woman who was part of the religious group I grew up in. Her name was Colleen Hammond, and she actually got her start in I think she was like a weather news anchor, I think is what she was. But she wore pants. She just wore everyday normal clothes. And I think it was through her conversion story that she really changed how she dressed. And her book really focused on, again, like the title was Dressing with Dignity, so dressing in a dignified way, but it went much further than that. Like, the message was that you had to dress modestly, but it wasn't just modestly. Modesty was a certain type of clothing to her. So you had to have sleeves to sleeves of a certain length. You couldn't have like your shirt collar, for instance, couldn't be any lower than 2 fingers below the pit of your throat. Skirts had to be a certain length, and like it even went down to the types of material that a woman could wear. She had like all of these tests that women would have to go through in order to determine if a shirt or a skirt or whatever was appropriate, essentially. And so it like I grew up with that, and because of that, like there's always like this hyper focus, and I've mentioned this in a couple of other podcast episodes on purity culture. Like there's always this hyper focus on dressing a certain way so as we don't, draw too much attention to ourselves and don't draw too much attention to our butt, too much attention to my boobs, too much attention to my waist. But at the same time, like I was also told that we should accentuate our waist because it was a feminine feature. And like looking back on that, it's very ironic to me that they would say something like, we should accentuate our waist because it's a feminine feature, because so is our butt and our breasts. Like they are also a feminine feature. They are what lends us to femininity. That is what indicates to the world around us that we are female. And so like the idea that we can only accentuate certain aspects of our female psyche is just insane to me. Like certain parts of it are okay for people to see, but other parts are sinful for people to see. And like looking back, it's just ironic and it makes no sense to me. But that was what like people really pushed and people really like tried to live by. And it was very damaging growing up in that, because like you always felt like it was never good enough. Like even now to this day, I will like hyper analyze outfits that I'm wearing if I have to be around a certain group of people or a certain type of person that I know thinks this way. So yeah, it definitely changes your mindset to grow up like that. Another aspect of the good woman was the fact that when she gets married, before I should address this, I should actually also address the idea of submission. Actually, a good woman is always submissive, and she's not just submissive to, her husband and her dad. She's also submissive to the authority of all men in her life to a certain extent. Like I feel like it wasn't necessarily a conscious thing that I was raised with, but through like subconscious messaging and like things I was taught growing up, I had this subconscious idea that I had to submit to the men in my life simply because of their God-given position of authority. And because they had this quote unquote God-given position of authority, they knew better. So I had to submit to them. If they said, no, we have to do it a certain way, I had to take a step back. I couldn't voice my opinion because a man had said, no, this is the way we're going to do things. And so, like, that also was very difficult for me, and actually a lot of girls I knew growing up, because, you know, when you're given talents and things by God, and then told that you're not allowed to use them because it isn't your place. It isn't your place to go to college. It isn't your place to work outside the home, even before marriage. It isn't your place to have any kind of higher education. I was even told that women should never have been given the right to vote. It was messaging like that basically, like, hammered into my brain, like, this subconscious message that women were almost like a second class citizen. But at the same time, I was also told things like, women have a higher dignity than men, because men have to go out into the world and conquer it, but women get to stay home, and we have a higher relationship with God because we create life. So women have a higher dignity, but you're not allowed to do all these things because men said so. Because when it really came down to it, like, all of this submissiveness that these people pushed for isn't actually biblical. But they really pushed for it as, you know, the gender roles. This is the way it's supposed to be. This is the way God intended it. And it's actually not the way God intended it at all. I mean, if you actually read the Bible and read the book of Ephesians and read the epistles and you read Colossians and you read the book of Genesis, like, this is not the way God intended the relationship between a man and a woman at all. But these people really push for, like, a woman to submit to a man, not just in marriage, but in literally all aspects of life. And that also, like, because she's raised and / trained from a very young age to think that the men in her life have authority over her, that also bleeds over into her marriage. And that bleeds over into the sexual relationship. So a good woman is always sexually available to her husband 24/7 and always with a smile. And that is something that you'll see in a lot of traditionalist circles within Catholicism. That's something you're going to see in, like, fundamentalist Christianity. I've mentioned this before, you know, groups like FLDS, the IBLP, groups like that. Within Christianity, within Catholicism, you'll see groups like the SSPX, the CMRI, groups like that. They really push for, you know, submission in marriage, and then also, like, a woman always, she cannot deny her husband, ever. And so the fact that she has to be sexually available 24/7 with a smile, without the option of ever saying no for any reason whatsoever, in and of itself is extremely damaging and extremely wrong. But when you couple that message with the message of modesty, and she has to be sexual but not sexual, she has to be sexy, her brand is sexy, can't lead a man into sin, but also has to make a man wonder if there's something more to discover. So that's going to make her fearful of her own sexuality and constantly in this state of, like, fight or flight around it, essentially. And so that's going to bleed over into her marriage. And so when she gets married, all of a sudden she has to switch, like, click a switch from hide my sexuality is a sin, I can't be attractive, or I can't be too attractive, to being like a sex goddess and being sexually available 24/7 all the time for this man. And that has to happen within a space of 24 hours when you get married. And that kind of switch has actually led to a lot of physical problems and within women. Like, you'll actually see there have been increased rates of, pain and sex and vaginismus. I always forget how to pronounce that. I've heard it pronounced probably 50 times in my life, but I always forget how to pronounce it. But whatever. I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about. Anyways, so even if the sexual experience is a painful one, she's silent and she just gets through it because she can not deny her husband, because she has this marital duty to give him sex and she cannot deny him. And so the messaging around it turns into what that does is it turns sex not into a gift of self and this beautiful reenactment and renewal of our marriage vows, but it turns it into an obligation. Like, oh, I have to do this. I don't want to do this, but I have to do it. I have to get through it, because if I don't, I'm committing a sin. So you're not actually giving a gift of yourself at all when this happens. And it really cheapens, the sexual intimacy between a man and a woman when this happens. And so, like, that idea of always being sexually available to your husband 24/7, it cheapens it. It really cheapens sexual intimacy, because you're not given the choice to give that gift of yourself, because you have to give it. You have no choice in the matter. Your choice has been taken away. And so it's sad. It's like, it's actually heartbreaking, actually, when I think about all of the women I know who I've had conversations with them and actually gotten into arguments with them, and they're like 100% sold on the idea that they have no choice, that they have, when their husband says now, they have to. And they can't say no if they're in pain. They can't say no if they legitimately have a headache. I know everybody laughs, oh, I have a headache. What if you actually do? What if you actually are sick? What if you actually are exhausted because you have 5 toddlers and you didn't get to bed until midnight, but your husband wants to go, but you've been going since 5 a.m. because your 4 or 5-year-old got up at 5 a.m. and wouldn't go back to sleep. So you're running off of 3 hours of sleep because you also have a newborn that was up every 2 hours all night long. You still don't have a choice. These women have no choice. They have to give it to their husbands. And so it's very damaging to be raised with that, sexy and not sexual, and, don't tempt the men, and then, have to flip that switch when you get married and all of a sudden be sexually available 24/7, pain or no pain, no matter what. It twists sexuality within marriage, and it cheapens it into something really, truly ugly in my mind. It's an obligation, and that is not what God intended for sexual intimacy with marriage. Like, God intended sexual intimacy to be unitive and procreative, and this renewal of like I said before, this renewal of our wedding vows. And when we get married, like, we freely, for most of us at any rate, we freely choose to say, I do commit to this person. And so when you have sex, it should mirror that. The sexual intimacy of, the marital act should mirror that. And you should be freely saying, I do, every single time. And you shouldn't feel like you have to. If you feel like you have to, there's something wrong. And you should be able to say to your husband, no, this isn't right. I don't like this. Something's wrong. We need to stop. But for a lot of women raised in this purity culture and this culture of submission and, dressing a certain way and modesty and all this, they can't say no. And so, like I said, it cheapens it. And like this, the idea of, submission in, their sexual lives bleeds over also into, taking responsibility for the sins of, certain types of sins that a man may commit around her. So outside of marriage, that would look like she's walking down the street and a man sees her and, lusts after her. She's responsible because he saw her, and for whatever reason, based off of what she looked like, he was tempted. And so that was her fault, even though she has no idea what just happened. She has no idea. She could be wearing a nun's habit. He sees her, he's tempted, she did something, is the messaging behind this. And so a lot of girls, again, grow up with I myself am one of those. Scrupulosity is huge. Like I said, I mentioned earlier, I will take days to plan an outfit if I'm going around certain types of people, because that scrupulosity is just hardwired into you, because you have to dress a certain way, and nothing can be too tight, nothing can be too low, nothing can be too short, sleeves can't be too short, because if you do, then you're going to be accused of tempting men, and just on and on and on and on. And if you do tempt a man, then you are responsible for his sin. I've literally been told I would be punished in hell for the sin of a man if he was tempted by me. He was not responsible, I was. And so that messaging also bleeds over into marriage. We can actually also apply that to marriage, because a woman will be accused of, not being submissive enough, not being obedient enough, not praying for him enough, if a man, develops a porn addiction, or if I've heard of cases of, a man being abusive, like physically, verbally, mentally abusive to his wife and his family, and the wife going to elders in her church or to the priest of her church and begging for help, because a lot of times these women have no recourse, or they haven't been taught that they do have resources and they do have recourse to the law and things like that. They haven't been taught that. They've been taught to go to their elders. So they go to the elders of their church begging for help, and these women are told, no, this isn't him. This is you. You're not being submissive enough. You're not being obedient enough. You're undermining his authority. You aren't, submitting to him in the bedroom. You aren't praying hard enough. Things like that. And so they're basically taught that every action of the man in their life is their fault. He has a pornography addiction because I didn't give it to him enough. I was too tired. I didn't give him sex. And so he had no choice but to, watch porn. I wasn't submissive enough, so he had no choice but to become angry with me and slap me, or, slap one of the kids, or whatever may have happened. He had no choice but to, verbally berate me in front of my children. Things like that. So it's never the man. It's the woman, it's the wife not being submissive enough. And all of this messaging all comes down to, how purity culture twists the image of what a good Christian woman actually is. And, another thing that I've noticed being pushed, and I've seen it pushed very, very heavily, especially within the last couple of years, during COVID and the last 3 to 4 years, and it really got bad during COVID. But everyone, these influencers on Instagram and on Twitter especially, or X as it's called now, are always talking about a woman's God-given role of keeper at home, and how we cannot step outside of those bounds, because if we step outside of those bounds, then, we're going to be cursed, and we're we're stepping outside of the umbrella of authority, which apparently I had no idea was even used outside of certain denominations. But like I started researching like where the umbrella of authority was. It's everywhere, the idea of the umbrella of authority. But these women, if they, they step outside of their keeper, the role of keeper at home, then they're not fulfilling their role of biblical womanhood. Because their idea of biblical womanhood is basically barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. Like, you cannot be a biblical woman if you do anything else. If you have a calling to me, I've had one woman suggest to me that even if a woman had a calling to be a midwife, which is like and I feel like anybody would say this, it is one of the most feminine jobs a woman can possibly hold. I mean, you're literally helping other women bring life into this world. You're helping other women give birth. It is one of the most feminine and intimate jobs you could possibly have. I had a woman suggest to me that if a wife went and became trained as a midwife, she was failing in her duty to be a keeper at home. So we can't even be midwives. We can't even be nurses. Even if we have no children at home, none. This woman firmly believed that women had to stay home because that was, and I'm quoting her here, that was our place. We had no place outside of the home, according to her, because we had to be submissive and meek. What was it? She told me we had to be submissive. It was in an email, but we have to be submissive, meek, and it was like gentle of tongue or something like that. And so, according to her, in her mind, if we became a midwife, God forbid, if we were a midwife, apparently, then we're not going to be meek and mild of tongue anymore. And it's just, it blew my mind. It blew my mind. She suggested that, we shouldn't do that because there were other women that were going to reject God's teachings. And that we should just leave the rebellion of women to them and try to teach them biblical womanhood. And when I asked her who was, going to be a midwife, because also this woman also told me that we shouldn't be going to the doctors. We should learn like herbal remedies and stuff like that. But then she turns around and says, so women shouldn't go to the doctor, but we can't be midwives. And if women can't be midwives, then who are we to go to give birth? Because then our only option is go to the doctor. But we can't go to the doctor either, according to her. So it was like they talk themselves in circles. They don't know what they want, honestly, when it really boils down to it. But that's the image of the good woman, sexy, not sexual. She has to be sexually available to her husband 24/7. She has to submit to, men in all areas of her life, and she has to submit to all men in her life. We're talking like older brothers, fathers, husbands, church elders, the rando man on the street who thinks his opinion's more important than hers. She takes responsibility for their sin if they claim to have been tempted by her. She's, the keeper at home without question, even if she has no responsibilities at home. She's not allowed to step outside of that role. She submits to her husband in all things. When it comes to submitting to her husband in all things, this is where it gets funny. So there's certain types of submission I've noticed. So you have the marriages that are called complementarian marriages. So those marriages are the stereotypical Ephesians, I think it's Ephesians 22, 24, 5, or 24 through 25, where it says, wives, submit to your husband as unto the Lord in all things. And those women are the complementarian marriages. They're part of the complementarian thing where, they're sometimes allowed to have an opinion, and voice that opinion to their husbands, but ultimately he has the final say in the household. And I know a lot of women who talk about this. They talk about how, yeah, my husband has the final say. And it was only a couple years ago that I was talking to my husband about that. And I was like, it's never made sense to me because, like, if you're allowed to have an opinion, but then he can turn around and, make a decision completely contrary to your opinion, does your opinion even matter? And if your opinion doesn't matter, then why bother having it in the first place? What's the point? What's the point of having an opinion if, there's such a power imbalance that he can turn around and just negate that opinion or what you think should happen, just at the drop of a hat, just because he thinks he knows better, because he knows better. And so, that was just, it seemed very odd to me. And then you have the egalitarian marriages where, it's modeled more after, the entire chapter, Ephesians 22, where it talks about mutual submission. It talks about wives submitting to your husbands, and it also talks about husbands loving your wives as Christ loved and died for the church, giving himself up for her, basically commanding both men and women to sacrificially submit and love each other. And what I found really beautiful was, like, in this collection of verses, it starts off with submit one to another. And then St. Paul goes into the details of how we are to submit to each other. And so he basically is giving men and women both, like, this mission in marriage, and how to, basically, he just gave us a blueprint on a gold platter of how to have a successful Christian biblical marriage. And I've heard a lot of people describe that as an egalitarian marriage, or like a partnership where you make mutual decisions. I've heard people practice this by basically whoever has the most experience in whatever they're trying to decide makes the decision. But I do feel like there's definitely still a place for, like, biblical manhood. Like, for example, like, I'm Catholic, so we pray the rosary a lot, and I like my husband to lead the rosary. Like, I don't mind leading it if he doesn't want to lead it, but I honestly, like, prefer to defer to him in those areas. Like, you lead the rosary, or if we're, driving somewhere, you drive. I like him, taking the lead in, like, religious things, where we're going to go to mass, things like that. Now, like, if I had a real problem with, where we were going to church, we obviously wouldn't go there, because he would never put me in a position where I felt so uncomfortable, especially in an area of, like, my faith, things like that. And that ties right back into mutual submission and sacrificial love, where I am sacrificing my pride for him and letting him lead in areas where I feel like I want to lead, but I feel like it would be better for the family if he did. And he does the same to me. He does the same for me. He will defer and submit, if you want to say that. He will submit to me in areas where I might have more expertise, such as, potty training, or child rearing, or cooking, or just, things like that. Things where I obviously have more talents, or areas of expertise. Money management. I'm better at budgeting than he is. So I actually manage the family budget, things like that. And so, like, this idea of a woman having to submit to her husband in all things is, in my mind, and, like, I've done years of research on this, and I know there's going to be a lot of people that listen to this and have a huge problem with this last part of this episode, but I firmly 100% believe that this idea that a woman must submit to her husband in all things without question, and the man has to, be a priest and something else. It's this weird term that people use, but priest of his household is such a twisting of scripture, because it basically lowers women to property, in my mind, to children, because you're supposed to guide and discipline your wife. I mean, once you start down that road, where do you stop? She was also given talents and a mind by God, and she is every bit as worthy as you are. Why would you treat her any less? And so, I really think I'm a huge believer in mutual submission in marriage. Like, my husband and I have had hours and hours and hours and hours of discussion over this, talking about St. Paul's letters. And because when we first got married, we both came from worlds where, from families where they pushed, wives, submit to your husbands. It was a thing. And we both struggled with the concept. But at the same time, like, we thought that was how marriage was supposed to be. Wives had to submit to their husbands. And so because of that, our marriage was very, very rocky in the beginning, because, like, I wanted to live that, but it felt so wrong to me. Like, it felt wrong. And he wanted to live that as well, but at the same time, he didn't believe in it, and it felt wrong to him. And so, like, it caused a lot of problems. And so we had to, like, really look into, like, read all the marriage books, and, like, really dig into the Bible, and, like, try to figure out, and, like, talk to priests and talk to people and try to figure out, like, what God actually intended for marriage, because, like, what we had been taught was just, it was so wrong. And, like, the image again of the good and perfect submissive woman and wife that we had been taught just felt wrong. And so, like, it was mainly me. He'd done a huge journey when it comes to, like, purity culture and everything. He kind of already, like, figured out what he believed and what he thought was right. But I had to, like, really disentangle myself from that idea, because I'd already kind of started to, but at the same time, I still really struggled with, like, guilt and shame and scrupulosity and overthinking everything. Like, I was scared of everything, and, like, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm stepping outside of the bounds of what God wants? And what if I really am tempting every man around me? What if I am responsible? What if, by putting on this shirt or this pair of jeans, I'm being too sexy, or whatever the thing was? Like, what if I'm showing off too much? Or maybe I should be I remember in the beginning, I was like, oh shoot, maybe I shouldn't be wearing these. I was wearing a set of rain gear. And anybody who's ever seen, like, rain pants, raincoats, knows how big, ugly, and baggy they are. They're just the most hideous things. You look like you're wearing, like, tarps. They're horrible. And I remember thinking maybe I should wear a skirt over this. And then, like, stopping and being like, wait a minute. What? Why would I wear a skirt? This is ridiculous. What am I thinking? And so it was like that kind of upbringing, that kind of thinking, like, just seeps into your mind. But that was the image of a good woman, Christian woman, that was perpetuated when in purity culture. That's the image that is presented to you, and it's incredibly damaging, and it's extremely hard to move away from. But I feel like it needs to be talked about more. People need to talk about this. People need to write about it. They need to read about it. They need to study it. They need to understand that this is not what God wants for women at all. Thank you guys very much for listening to this episode of All Our Little Messes. Before we close up, I wanted to remind you all, I do have a blog. I write 2 to 3 times a week on different aspects of Christianity, Catholicism, life, politics, all kinds of things. Right now, I've got a short series on purity culture and like sex education with children within purity culture going on. So I will include a link in the podcast description to the mailing list. So if anybody would like to get those automatically delivered to their inbox every week, they can just sign up for that underneath. So please feel free, if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave me a review and any comments. And thank you guys very much. I'll see you guys next week. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of All Our Little Messes. Please let us know how much you enjoyed it below and add any questions you have about this episode. Also, don't forget to follow us on Patreon for amazing exclusive perks, including early access to podcast episodes and bonus episodes every month. We've also recently added a support group for all of our paid patrons. You can check us out on Facebook and Instagram for daily updates and insights that mirror podcast topics. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.